I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove, who's going to talk to us about the past, present, and future of serosurveillance. Dr. Van Kerkhove is well known to so many of us who were watching WHO during the last 4 years over the course of the pandemic, as she was a technical lead for the COVID-19 response. She's also the Emerging Diseases and Zoonoses unit head and the MERS coronavirus technical lead in WHO's Health Emergency Department. Dr. Van Kerkhove's main research interests include zoonotic, respiratory, and emerging re-emerging viruses such as avian influenza, MERS, Ebola, Marburg plague, and Zika. She's somebody who has a long history in promoting serosurveillance, has worked with many Canadians over time. And Dr. Van Kerkhove, we're delighted that you're able to make some time to join us this morning. So over to you, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to join in virtually to the meeting. I really appreciate, I wish I could have been there in person. It's been a while since I've been to Canada, but hopefully I can come back there again soon. I'm going to give a bit of an overview on some of the work that we are involved in related to serosurveillance. And in particular, looking at some specific studies, which we have called many different things over time, really enhanced surveillance using seroepidemiology to address some main questions. We are building on looking at preparedness. And at WHO, we're looking at how we can utilize the work, the lessons learned from all of the past outbreaks and pandemics that we've had to be better prepared for the next one. So about in 2010, 2011, many of us around the world came together to address challenges that we saw with regards to influenza seroepidemiology, influenza serology, and in particular, avian influenza. And over the course of a year or so, several of us, many of us from around the world, ended up being around 200 people around the world, established what we called was the Consortium for the Standardization of Influenza Seroepidemiology, or CONCISE. And this was aimed to be an international partnerships of individuals from a number of institutions around the world who work on influenza. If you remember, around that time, there was a lot of questions around dual use. There were a lot of questions around H5N1, and there was a paper that came out that suggested that in terms of H5N1 circulation, that seroprevalence studies told us that there were millions of infections missed around the world, something like that, if I remember carefully. And we thought, many of us thought, well, that's just not possible based on the data we've seen from seroepidemiology studies for H5N1. And one of the challenges to do a meta-analysis was the fact that all of these studies were done different ways. They used different methodologies, they used different assays, they collected samples at different time points. And so when you try to combine them, we weren't able to combine them because of the heterogeneity within the studies themselves. So we started CONCISE, and we organized ourselves into two interactive working groups. One was an EPI working group, which was led by myself, and I was at Imperial College when it started, but then I moved over to Institut Pasteur. Now I'm with WHO, of course. And then we did a laboratory working group, which was co-led by Drs. Atmar Engelhardt and John Wood, both from the UK. And what we did over the course of several years were develop a series of protocols that could be utilized. There's generic protocols that can be utilized. Oh, I see Olav just turned on his screen. Olav has been part of CONCISE since the beginning. We developed these protocols that could be used across multiple study sites so that when the studies were conducted, we were basically, the results, we could compare the results, compares apple with apples instead of apples with oranges, if you will. We developed these protocols for influenza. They were adapted for MERS after MERS emerged in 2012. They were actually adapted for Zika in 2017 with the public health emergency of international concern. They were adapted for influenza. Then they were adapted again for COVID. And now we're in a new stage of the utilization of these protocols. So it's a labor of love for those of us who have been involved in this for 13, 14 years now. So the objectives of Concise, and I put these up here because we are now reviving Concise, and we would love to have some of you involved with us, as many of you would like to be involved, to maintain this interactive network of influenza and now COVID, academic and public health researchers and professionals who can work together with us to better understand the role of serology for influenza. And we're going to be expanding to respiratory pathogens as well. We want these generic protocols to be used in pandemic, epidemic, and outbreak settings. I refuse to use the phrase peacetime because I don't believe that exists anymore, but we want to be able to utilize these protocols over time so that we build a body of evidence that countries can use this information to look at trends as we go over time. So this is back in progress. We had a meeting in Hong Kong in November. Some of you were at to revive Concise. And again, if anybody wants to get involved, please don't hesitate to reach out. These are some of the major institutions that we were working with, and we look to expand. The EPI working group activities were in collaboration with our lab working group, was to recommend best practices to standardize the approach to the studies. So this was specifically focusing on flu as a start, but of course, this is now being used for many other pathogens. And to support countries who wish to carry out these studies, whether it was in the adaptation of the protocols to make them context specific, whether it was through the implementation of them or the report writing, the reporting of the results and releasing of those results. So we developed the protocol templates, we have questionnaires, we provided recommendations on which studies should be conducted when, depending on the objectives and the certain context, provide guidance on adaptation of these tools for the local context and the specific objectives, provide guidance on the implementation, and to work with the lab side to make sure that the right assays were being used, the sample collection timing was appropriate for the objectives, et cetera, and to support in the write-up. The laboratory working group was set up to coordinate and standardize the international serology laboratory response, developing standardized and assays that were for common serology protocols, developing mechanisms to rapidly generate and distribute international serologic standards to enable direct comparison between different labs, and to foster and establish a laboratory network to share these protocols and explore the usefulness of novel serologic assays. Now, the landscape has changed completely in terms of lab, but a focus on laboratory aspects is really critical. The epi side, arguably, it's much more straightforward than the laboratory aspects. So we developed these protocols for flu. So we had several, these are the list of the protocols that we had: a prospective longitudinal cohort study, cross-sectional seroprevalence studies, household transmission studies, closed setting investigation protocols. We had a specific one for healthcare personnel for H7 and 9. We had a protocol for seasonal influenza, and we had a standard protocol for zoonotic influenza, looking at close contacts of for avian influenza. Over time, we adapted these for Zika. So these are the protocols that we updated for Zika because it was really critical that we looked at, we used serology for this really important pathogen that became a public health emergency of international concern, making sure that we were looking at appropriate populations, we were looking at mothers and their infants, and especially looking at over time, looking at women and newborns over time. And this was a great collaboration that we did, and some of these protocols were used for a few years, and the work on this actually continues. There's a meta-analysis that is being undertaken right now of the cohort studies of women and newborns, actually looking at this over time. So we just wanted to demonstrate that it wasn't just important for influenza, but that the seroepidemiology and protocol standardization was really important for other pathogens like Zika. Then we adapted for MERS. So the protocol types for MERS are very similar to avian influenza for influenza, but really looking at trying to better understand the extent of infection. And in this case, this is a relatively rare infection We do have some amplification events in nosocomial and healthcare facilities. And these protocols have been used in a number of different countries, in Qatar, in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Iran. We've used them. I need to update this slide. We use them in Pakistan. They've been adapted in Africa as well, which is really important because there are different viruses, there are different clades of MERS-CoV viruses that are in circulation. And seroepi really helps us understand the extent of infection when surveillance, PCR-based surveillance, is quite limited for a pathogen like MERS outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight here is that at the time, we considered these type of studies to be outbreak investigations, enhanced surveillance. And I mention this because in 2014 to 2016, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, there was a lot of attention that was made to these types of studies. And some classified these as quote unquote research studies, which triggered a cascade of IRB approval and ethical approval. Now, I want to be very clear that all of our protocols, whether they're called enhanced surveillance or research or not, all include informed consent, and they all include requirements for ethical approval based on the local context. But it was really interesting to me that some institutions said, oh my God, please don't call these research, please call them enhanced surveillance. The bottom line is we see these protocols, which we now labeled the Unity protocols, and I'll come to that in a moment, as part of a suite of tools that countries need to cover everything from routine surveillance, case definitions, case reporting forms, all the way through specific investigations to really understand the extent of infection in certain types of settings, enhanced surveillance and case finding, clinical investigations, looking at protocols that evaluate the impact of interventions, all the way through clinical trials. And I've used this slide a lot over the years just to articulate this range of activities that countries need to focus on to really understand and conduct research for epidemic-prone pathogens. Now we say pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential. We published quite a bit over time, and this was important so that the work was not just in the form of protocols, but actually was in the scientific literature so that they could be referenced. We even published the ROSES statement, which was trying to standardize the reporting, because one of the problems we saw is that whether the studies were done or not following a standard approach, the reporting of them were, they varied in quality, let's just say. So even if the studies were conducted, some of the time through the publications, we couldn't tell what the methods were. So we really wanted to have a statement out there to talk about the reporting so that those of us that were using and utilizing this information could really understand the methods of the study. So then in 2020, we adapted these very, very quickly for what we were calling at the time nCoV. It wasn't even called SARS-CoV at the time. The first protocol that we published, which was on the first few hundred or the first few X, and their context was published at the end of January 2020. And within these protocols, and there was a household transmission study published very quickly after that. Within these protocols, we even had information that changed the timing of the exposure of contacts, where we included information, or we wanted to obtain information about exposure prior to the onset of symptoms of the case, because we had known early on in China that people were testing PCR positive before symptoms began. So this was really helpful for us to really articulate and understand some of the basic epi parameters. And these are all of the protocols that we developed for SARS-CoV-2, for COVID, during the course of the pandemic. And we branded these the Unity studies. We called them Unity because there was the clinical trial, the Solidarity trials were also ongoing, and people were confused of what were the Solidarity clinical trials, which were focusing on vaccines, versus the Unity study protocols that were really looking at seroepidemiology. And this really took off. And with Isabelle Bergerie, who was working with me under our health operations and the emergency response, many people in our regional offices, many people here in HQ, many of you who are part of the Unity study protocols, we had massive uptake of the Unity protocols globally. And as of the end, by the end of December 2021, we had 103 member states who had started implementing at least one study that was aligned with our protocols. And what we're very proud of is that more than half of these were from low and middle income countries. In the past, we had seen basically seroepi being done by high income countries. And this is a real game changer. Not only were they low and middle income countries, we had some conducted in humanitarian settings where people told us that it's just not possible to do. So this was a game changer for us, and this is something that we want to sustain. The workforce, the capacities to be able to carry out seroepi studies, and of course, these studies also include molecular testing, they include sequencing where possible, and the data remains local. The data is owned by the researchers and utilized by local researchers. And what we've been able to do was to work with people in country who've carried out these protocols to conduct regional and global meta-analyses. We also have a great collaboration with our colleagues in Canada at Sero Tracker to track these on their dashboard, which is now co-branded with WHO, to have a publicly available dashboard to be able to look at SARS-CoV-2 seroprevalence. And this allowed the rapid sharing of results and publications so that we can actually look at this across the landscape and across the globe of where these seroprevalence studies were being conducted. And I mention this because for COVID-19, this has remained really critical. We've looked at seroprevalence over time, we've looked at waning immunity over time, and this is part of our response. And what we're doing right now is we're transitioning from crisis mode to longer-term disease management, and we want to maintain capacities. We want countries to calibrate the response and maintain capacities. And the work on seroepi and the use of these protocols is part of that. And we feel that this workforce, these capacities that exist now globally, can be utilized into the future for many different types of pathogens. So we want to leverage, we want to calibrate, we want to sustain, and we want to show the utility of, and this is just a slide looking at different types of surveillance activities, and seroprevalence is down on the right-hand side here. There's multiple components of surveillance. Seroepi, serosurveillance remains a critical part of our understanding of pathogen circulation, and they can be used for viruses beyond respiratory pathogens. This is a slide I use quite a lot of looking at some key elements for preparedness. The work on seroepi covers a lot of these. Some of these are highlighted here in pink, but I just highlight develop trust and engaging communities. We needed to work with communities to be able to carry out the studies themselves, to provide results to communities for action, to provide results to the local entities to inform disease control and whatnot, as well as from local all the way up to our discussions with SAGE and looking at vaccination policies for the globe. So now we're looking at what we've done, and we are updating all of our protocol templates based on our experiences with COVID over the last 4 years, and adapting all of the protocols that we have for respiratory pathogens in general, because if the next pathogen X could be a respiratory pathogen, so generic, but also updating the protocols for influenza specifically, for COVID, and for MERS. And so we've gotten a little fancy with our branding here. We have a website with all of this now where you can actually pull down and look at the protocols themselves. They come with questionnaires. They're quite detailed. We welcome any feedback and any involvement you want to have. And the reason this is so critical for us is this is actually an old slide I need to update. But one of the things we're doing, I need to update my bio. I'm sorry for this. I've actually taken over as acting director of our Department for Epidemic and Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness, which covers a broad spectrum of diseases, including influenza and Mpox, some bacteria, arboviruses, because the work that we do, the work that has been done for COVID, response to COVID is pandemic preparedness for the future. This map is illustrating an aggregate risk of spillover of pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential. There's 18 pathogens that we've included, viruses and bacteria. And what we want to use this for is better preparedness for enhancing surveillance activities, making sure that we utilize the enhanced PCR-based capacities, making sure lab algorithms make sense, make sure we have good clinical care pathways, differential diagnosis, IPC, risk communication, et cetera, et cetera. And if we're going to be doing serology, what we might want to do is if we think of some high exposure populations, we may want to do multiple pathogen serology. So this type of mapping can inform the work to basically say, well, we thought of these particular pathogens, but these other ones were not on our radar. So we've had some initial discussions around the opportunities and possibilities of doing multiple pathogen serology. It's a huge effort to do these studies. So perhaps we may want to expand and not do something for a singular pathogen. This, of course, is quite important for arboviruses. We're seeing a massive expansion of dengue. And this is going to change with climate change. As the climate changes, we will update these maps. We will look at vector distribution, geographic distribution further north, further south, for example, and update these based on El Nino, El Nina, looking at livestock patterns, looking at trade as much as we can. It's all data dependent. So many of you have contributed to this, so thank you for that. So there's a lot of work that we want to continue to do. We want to expand the use of these for pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential, looking at rodent-borne, blood-borne, arboviruses, and have some other disease-specific protocols like for Mpox, for example. I think, so we were keeping up the momentum for Concise. And I needed to sorry, I should have taken this slide out, but basically we've decided to keep Concise going. If you want to get involved in this, the success of this is based on those of you who kind of drive this forward. So we're happy to get you involved. And there's massive thanks to lots of people who've been involved in this over time. And I think that's it. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Great way to start off the day. It's always good to look back and be humbled by history, because those who perhaps got their first experience dealing with pandemics and trying to put together surveillance systems might not have appreciated some of the history that you covered, especially with respect to the Concise effort. And it's great to see that Concise is alive and well, and looking at moving into other pathogens of concern and potentially into multi-pathogen assessments in the context of a world that has no longer any peacetime, as you said. So with that, we're going to move to a discussion